So, as we begin, we're going to continue on with this material. We already covered the XYZ affair. Adams will avoid a costly war with France. That's very important. And as a result, he was nearly defeated, but it really did work well. I mean, in the long run, it was good for the United States. And so we'll pick up with this material. So let's have prayer as we begin. Today, we will continue on with these early presidencies. If we have time, we may get into the War of 1812. And that's definitely almost a forgotten conflict, but it has a lot of important implications for the founding of the United States. So let's pray. Father, we do pray for your special grace and blessing, that your hand would be upon us, and in this class that you would guide us. I pray that you'll be in this world situation, be with what is going on in the Middle East, be with England and other countries that are affected by what is happening in Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Arab countries that have and were planning on making peace deals with Israel because of Donald Trump's initiative. And this is being done to disrupt that. I pray that you would just work to have your special blessing on them. And in this class, I pray for your special presence and help in everything that we do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, now, two of the most important things that happened in Adams' presidencies are the passing of these two pieces of legislation, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. Taken together, they are called the Alien and Sedition Acts. It makes perfect sense that you would do that. But anyway, what people don't understand is that America was very young at this point, and there was not a political mechanism and discourse, and there was real fear, especially upon people like Mrs. Adams, Abigail, that she would was afraid that some of the rhetoric that was hurling insults in the paper and stirring up discontent might actually fervent real violence against her husband. And that was a concern of hers. I've been to John Adams' home up in Quincy, Massachusetts. It used to be called Braintree. That's where the Nazarene University is. If anyone's ever heard of Eastern Nazarene University, it's now a university, I thought. It was a college for much longer than any of the other schools. But anyway, that school is there in Quincy. Also, the place where Dunkin' Donuts originated from. So it's a lot of important things that's happened in that town. But anyway, you can go and visit their house, and not only is it the Adams, John Adams, but John Quincy Adams, and other descendants, multiple generations of important individuals have lived there. They really needed to get a handle on things. And so, the first thing is an issue, the Alien Act empowered the president to deport any person who they felt was a threat to the stability of the country without a trial, treating them as what they very well may be, aliens. Now, they also extended the residency for citizenship to 14 years, that you had to live in the United States for 14 years before you could apply for citizenship, and at any time prior to that, if the president thought you were dangerous, all he had to do was order you out of the country and you had to leave. This was a problem for diplomats, a problem for other people who were trying to live in the United States. And there was fear, especially after Edward Genet and the French uprising, there was a significant issue of international intrigue. The other was sedition. And this is where First Amendment rights and the freedom of the press and other things would come into conflict. Back then, they really didn't have this idea of suing because of someone might be considered to be in violation of the First Amendment or whatever, freedom of the press or freedom of speech, but criminalized attacking the character of the president or members of Congress. There was a pamphlet written that suggested that John Adams was not an honorable person, suggesting that he was not displaying the characteristics of either a man or a woman. I don't know, he would have fit right in today. That he did not have the, that he was sort of genderless. Some big fancy word for that. They called him toothless. They called him all kinds of things. And Mrs. Adams was just appalled by this. He said they would never have called General Washington any of these names, and John Adams suggested they could have called him toothless because he was toothless. John Adams had all his teeth, and that was not true about him at all. But these laws became a major problem. Many newspaper men were put in jail. And one of them was Callender. A man by the name of Mr. Callender was put in jail for violating the Sedition Act and writing attacks on John Adams. Eventually, he will go over to the other side and attack President Jefferson. He's the man who will write a lot of the things about Jefferson and his escapades with his slaves, Sally Heming, and so forth. So he was an equal opportunity abuser. And Jefferson could do nothing about that because he pardons everyone who violated the Alien and Sedition Acts that were still in prison. When he becomes president, one of the first things he does and nullifies those laws. Now, here in the South, Kentucky and Virginia, they passed nullification resolutions that were designed to set up a contrast between the state governments and the federal governments. So, we here in Kentucky were involved with that, as well as Virginia. Some believe that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Act and had it sent to the legislature here in Kentucky to be voted upon, whereas James Madison wrote the one that was eventually enacted in Virginia. But what this did said that the states had more power than the federal government in all areas if the federal government is not specifically empowered to act in a particular area in the Constitution. And they passed these resolutions suggesting that both Kentucky and Virginia were willing to say that Kentucky was superior, the Kentucky state government was superior to the federal government in any area in which the Constitution does not specifically give the government power. Eventually, these will be overturned. But the theory here is that the states are equal to the federal government, at least, and in some cases superior. That is no longer the case. States are inferior to the federal government, especially because of how we went about freeing the slaves after the Civil War. The whole relationship between the states and the federal government shifted at that moment. So that created a change. Now, Mrs. Adams is worried that public criticism would encourage actual violence against the president. Now, we are coming up to the next election. Adams decides he's running for re-election, and he hopes to win. But Alexander Hamilton, behind the scenes, is pulling strings. Now, he is a sneaky little guy, Alexander Hamilton. It's very questionable as to whether or not he would have qualified to be president himself. That is a gray area. And in some ways, it would solve the whole Barack Obama problem of whether he was born in America or not and still been a natural-born citizen if he had run for president. Because Alexander Hamilton was certainly a founding father of the United States. But he was born in the Dominican Republic. And what do you do with these people who were born before the Constitution was written and whether or not they are natural-born citizens of the United States? You have to get to Martin Van Buren before you have a person who was born after the Declaration of Independence, who was president of the United States. So if Alexander Hamilton clearly believed that he qualified to be president. Now that doesn't happen because he is shot by this man in a duel at some point in his life, right at the end of his life, actually. He's shot. But Aaron Burr, while he's still vice president here, somewhere between 1800 and 1804, he kills Aaron Burr. Now, Aaron Burr is a very interesting person. He, behind the scenes, supports Thomas Pinckney to be president, and wants him to be the next president of the United States if John Adams falters. As a result of this, John Adams decides to fire several of his cabinet members who had been carried over from Washington because he believes that they are more loyal to Hamilton than they are to him. One is James McHenry, who was Secretary of War, and Thomas Pinckney, who was Secretary of State, the very person who was scheduled to be his vice president by his party if he was reelected. Jefferson, during the campaign, was attacked as godless and dangerous to American morals. And to be honest, in that day, we may think of Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, who refers to God all the time and so forth, but he basically was a deist who God didn't have a real role in his life on a daily basis. He was someone out there who helped order things and made sure that life didn't spin out of control. But as far as actually participating in a daily regimen that included God, no, that was not Thomas Jefferson. So I can believe that there were people who were scared that he would be a secularizing influence in the society. John Adams, the older he got, the more conservative and the more relatable to God and Jesus and so forth he became. So they take a divergent view here. Now, Jefferson and Burr will tie with 73 votes each in 1800. One of these electors was supposed to vote for somebody else other than Aaron Burr, so that he would only have 72 votes. But someone missed the memo. And as a result, they tied. Therefore, no one won. This is when it became obvious this system isn't working if we have parties and you're not running as individuals. because no one was nominated for vice president. They just told someone, don't vote for him because we want him to get one less vote so that he'll be vice president. You can see that in the very first attempt at doing this, it didn't work. And he would not back down. He was ambitious. He was very conniving and manipulative and was seen as dangerous. And Jefferson would not submit to Adams. Adams wanted a guarantee that he would not change some of his principles if he got the Federalists to vote for him in the House. But he wouldn't do that. So it carried on and carried on and carried on until 35 ballots were taken in the House without any resolution. In fact, the governors of Pennsylvania were ready to send the militia down to Washington to restore order. Civil war was on the verge of happening. Now, this is a whole week of taking these votes, one right after the other. They're all the same. Hamilton will eventually convince the Federalists to give in to prevent a Burr victory. Now, if we ever had a situation like this again, it isn't just that the House of Representatives, 435 members of the House, get together and they vote on who is president. It's not as simple as that, and it can't be. We have to come up with a complicated system, and this is how it works. Each state delegation of representatives is polled, and they get one vote per state. If a state is evenly divided among people of an opinion, let's say there are two representatives from a state, one's a Democrat, one's a Republican, they can't figure out who they want to vote for, guess what? They don't get to vote in this election. And you have to have a majority of the states vote for an individual. So the question is, back when the House, back some time ago, when Donald Trump was running or whatever, there was a majority, maybe it was when Clinton was running, there was some talk of this being thrown into the House, maybe with Ross Perot when he was running as a third party. Even though the Democrats controlled the House, they didn't control state delegations. So that would have given the Republicans an advantage. Now, today, in the Senate elects the vice president, the president is elected by the House in that case, and the Senate is just like you would normally think. Each senator votes, and it's majority rules. That's a little bit more simple. Now, the difference between Adams and Jefferson. Adams looked to the past, while Jefferson was looking to the future. Jefferson wanted to create a government that was more democratic with Republican principles that included the will of the people, less pretension, less monarchical airs. In fact, he would not wear shoes that had buckles on them. He thought tied shoes were more of the people. Even his fashion sense was more democratic. Adams wanted to cultivate ties with churches. Jefferson, in some ways, wanted to sever them. There was still a peaceful transfer of power. John Adams was the first president not to attend the inauguration of his successor. He left on the stage from the White House the day of the inauguration. Jefferson read an inauguration address, but his speaking voice was so faint that most people in the crowd could not hear what he had to say until they read the speech printed in the paper the next day. Jefferson was not a public speaker or a debater. Jefferson wore a plain black suit and shoes that tie no buckles. He did not wear even a fancy hat or a tuxedo or anything special, just ordinary business suit, we would say today. Now, economics and the politics at home. He was very frugal, Jefferson was, in government spending. Limited spending on formality and travel and etiquette. He cleared the national debt. And then we'll buy Louisiana. But anyway, he clears the national debt, paying off all of the money that had been assumed by the federal government to pay for the Revolutionary War. He let the Alien and Sedition Acts lapse. In 1804, Jefferson was reelected by a vote of 162 votes to Federalist Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. That's the brother of Thomas Pinckney, who these Pinckneys were always on the verge. Charles Pinckney, if anyone would ever be the patron saint of Southern politician that really believed in the inferiority of African Americans and slaves, that's him. I was at his home and in Charleston, South Carolina, and visited it. It's preserved by the National Park Service. But he is definitely was a proponent of slavery, with only 14. The Federalists will only survive at this point, even though he's from South Carolina. The only place where the Federalists got any votes were in New England. But Aaron Burr, interesting fellow, grandson of the great preacher Jonathan Edwards, grandson of Jonathan Edwards. He will kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel in New York or New Jersey. I can't remember which one, but they take him across the river into the other state where he died. That was the problem. They couldn't figure out who had jurisdiction over this murder, where he was shot or where he died. And in the meantime, he was able to escape back to Washington, where he lived for the rest of his vice presidency. He was a rising star, but at that point, he will then flee south and will be embroiled in a controversy in Louisiana area, where he is eventually indicted for treason, for trying to set up a situation where some of those southern territories, Louisiana, maybe Mississippi, Arkansas, would break off and form its own country under him. Now moving west. One of the biggest things that will happen during Jefferson's time is the Louisiana Purchase. And you will see the video that you watch for this unit is on the Corps of Discovery. That starts in Washington with Lewis and Clark, and they travel west, coming here to Kentucky, and they go to the area where now in northern Kentucky, Big Bone Lick State Park. They get supplies there, and then they eventually make their way down the Ohio and up the Mississippi River, and they then will travel up the Missouri to find the end of the Missouri River. The goal of this, the Corps of Discovery, is to find an all-water route to the west, because everyone hoped that you could sail all the way to the Pacific Ocean somewhere. Somehow, there must be a water route through the continent. Now, there isn't one, but they were hoping to find one. And they will go with the Missouri River all the way west, crossing eventually the Rocky Mountains, and then down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson is a strong believer in states' rights, but he does two things during his presidency that he would have opposed if it had been proposed by Adams or Washington. And one of them he definitely did oppose. There was talk of the federal government operating a military academy to train soldiers. And he was opposed to that when he was vice president under George Washington, or vice president under Adams, secretary of state under Washington, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say the federal government can do this. But guess who signed the piece of legislation authorizing West Point to have a military academy on it? Anyone hazard a guess? Jefferson. When he's president, he realized you can't just leave this to the states. Now, some states did have them. Virginia Military Institute, the Citadel in South Carolina, various other military schools around the country, but there needed to be a federal one. And so he was willing to sign the piece of legislation anyway. Another place where he breaks his Republican principles is with the purchase of Louisiana. Now, Jefferson is wanting to buy the city of New Orleans and any land that France will sell them in order for us to have unrestricted access to the Mississippi River. So really, all we're trying to do is buy this area right here. That's it. And so Jefferson has authorization from Congress to buy West Florida. West Florida is this area right here. That's West Florida. And the city of New Orleans, right there, for as much as $10 million. That's it. France has just received a gift from Spain of the land west of the Mississippi River in what today is Louisiana. And they decided that they would trade this to the United States if we are willing to pay for it, to invest in Haiti, which was at that time the most valuable colony in the French Empire. And so, in 1803, now in 1804, Haiti gets its independence. So it really doesn't work out that well for France, but nonetheless, at this point, they didn't realize that was going to happen. So they are willing to sell us this, and they say, how much will you give us for all of Louisiana? So Jefferson agrees to spend $15 million on all of Louisiana, even though Congress had not authorized that amount, and there's nowhere in the Constitution that says the federal government can buy land, or that the president can negotiate land sales on behalf of the United States. He would have been against this if he had not been president at the moment. Jefferson believed that this exceeded his authority as president, but the Senate ratified the agreement anyway by a vote of 26-6. In 1803, Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead the Corps of Discovery. The geographical goal was to find the Northwest Passage, observe all flora and fauna in the West, and new species were discovered. Jefferson wanted to know things like this. Do the woolly mammoths still roam on the prairie? What animals are there? And specimens were sent back. Maps were sent back. If you go to Monticello, Jefferson's home, you can still see hanging in the entryway the elk antlers and the little stuffed prairie dogs and various other things that were sent back by Lewis and Clark that are on display in Jefferson's home. There was also military and political goals for the Corps of Discovery. The territorial claims needed to be made in the West, and the best way to do that would be to explore it and state our claim. Now, interestingly enough, this was started before the sale went through. And the Spanish, who were down here, did send a military attaché late, but nonetheless, they were sent to try and capture them. Both on the way in and on the way out, their timing was off, so the Spanish never caught them. So, poor job of planning on their behalf either time. So they were coming up to get them 2 times. This is Spanish territory. Now, once they actually crossed over the Rocky Mountains and got into Oregon country, they were outside of the United States. This area was not part of the Louisiana Purchase, but they did get all the way to the end, and there at Fort Clatsop, they will winter before returning back east. They also wanted to find the commercial possibilities for the Northwest Passage, keep Britain in check with a presence in the Northwest. The expedition took 3 years, and back in 2003, 4, 5, there were actually a group of people who were recreating this event and going up the river to reenact the Corps of Discovery. And if you go to St. Charles, Missouri, to the Lewis and Clark Discovery Center, you can see the keel boats that were used in the reenactment. Now, when I was out there and visited that, it was during this period, and they were actually doing it at that time. So they weren't there yet. I just saw the building where they would be after they were done using it. But that's definitely worth seeing. Great. Now, this took 3 years. And while they were on their way, they met a man by the name of Charbonneau, who was a French trader, who they hired as a guide. Now, he was somewhat of an idiot and drunk half the time, not really any good. But his wife was a godsend. She saved the expedition. His wife was Sacagawea, and she was able to negotiate on their behalf as an Indian. She saved Meriwether Lewis's journals when they almost went overboard one time. She was also able to give the appearance of peace negotiations, because the Indians saw she and her child were present. They were less likely to be a raiding party of warlike invaders if they have a woman and child with them in the canoe. And the most interesting thing is that when they finally meet the Nez Perce Indians, who they were hoping to find, and to negotiate the sale of horses, it turns out that Sacagawea was the long-lost sister of the chief who had been captured by the Snake Indians and sold, and eventually she met up with Charbonneau and she married him. But it's almost like a miracle. You could not write a novel and make it sound believable that this woman, who's their translator, is the sister of the chief, who they have to convince to be nice to them and to give them horses. It works out great. Zebulon Pike is another person which we don't always talk about. This happens later, 1805 and 6. He explores up the Arkansas River to present-day Colorado, and then entered New Mexico and was arrested by Spanish authorities. But there is a peak in Colorado, the furthest east 15,000-foot mountain. The Arkansas River is here, and it goes out into Colorado. And does anyone know the peak that is named for Pike? What do you think it is? You are correct, Pike's Peak. Pike was also famous for being the first person to travel down the Colorado River in a wooden vessel and survive. So that will then sail down and come out into Mexican territory, into Spanish territory. So that's important to know. Now,
Now for another 60-second history report.
Think you're a good shopper? Well, maybe not as good as Thomas Jefferson. Back in 1803, a large part of what we now call the Pacific Northwest was controlled by France. And their leader, Napoleon, needed funds to build up his navy. The solution? The Louisiana Purchase. President Jefferson spent $15 million and got 530 million acres.
Thank you very much.
He doubled the size of the U.S. for about 4 cents an acre. He then sent Lewis and Clark to survey Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. These two led an expedition to explore this new land. They might not have made it through the first winter, though, if it wasn't for the help from a French trapper named Charbonneau and his wife, Sacagawea.
Hello.
Sacagawea, a member of the Shoshone tribe, kept the crew fed, served as translator, and even had a baby during the trek. She is now featured on the $1 coin. So here it is in a nutshell. Napoleon needed money. Jefferson got a steal of a deal. Country grew, we sent two, a Shoshone gal saved the day, and she earned $1 along the way.
That's the Louisiana Purchase in 60 seconds.
now, this I'm going to
This is a story about Napoleon and Jefferson and Talleyrand and foreign.
I'm going to turn this down a bit. This program here, On the Road with Charles Kuralt, was well known for its traveling around the country and finding little places. This helps explain, if you live in any place that used to be in the Louisiana Purchase, why the borders are where they are.
Intrigue in Paris and an empire changing hands. And this is the best place to tell the story. A swamp in Arkansas. By the time we get down to the end of this rickety wooden footbridge into the swamp, you'll see what I mean. The year was 1803. This swamp, all of Arkansas, in fact, the whole central part of what is now the United States was French. The French called it all Louisiana. President Thomas Jefferson wanted one tiny part of that vast French empire. All he wanted for the United States was the city of New Orleans. Jefferson sent James Monroe as ambassador to Paris to join Ambassador Robert Livingston there to negotiate with Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand, to buy New Orleans. They were authorized to pay as much as $7.5 million. What Monroe and Livingston didn't know was that Napoleon was plotting to declare himself Emperor of France and to go to war with England. He knew he didn't have the sea power to defend his vast possessions in the New World, and he knew that therefore England would probably just take them in the war to come. For the part reason, why not get rid of all that land in advance? Why not? No, to the United States. So, a long way from this swamp, in a Parisian drawing room, Livingston, who'd been getting nowhere with Talleyrand trying to buy New Orleans, was flabbergasted to hear the foreign minister say, "What if we sold you more than New Orleans? What would you give for the whole of Louisiana?" By which he meant the whole of America, between the Mississippi and the Rockies. The very next day, they agreed on a little land sale. Livingston didn't even know what he was buying. Lewis and Clark hadn't yet been west to see what was there. But they found the papers before Napoleon could change his mind. $12 million for a third of a continent. The United States was suddenly doubled in size. This swamp was suddenly American. Well, if you own something, you have to survey it. And to survey something, you have to start somewhere. Because the meridian and baseline crossed in this swamp, this is where they started. The inscription says, "This stone marks the base, established November 10th, 1815, from which the lands of the Louisiana Purchase were surveyed by United States engineers." If you live today in Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, your township boundaries, your section lines, the boundaries of your lot are based on this stone in the middle of a cypress swamp in Arkansas. This stone is a symbol of the American urge, the strongest urge in our history, to cross the rivers and head west. It's a symbol of the American itch to own a piece of land, to have it and hold it, enough for a flower garden, or enough for a cattle ranch. The Louisiana Purchase gave us this swamp, gave us all of Arkansas, gave us Louisiana, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, part of Texas, most of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, for about 2 cents an acre. There were some in the Senate who said it was too much. But you'll notice that the French, who thought they were getting a good deal at the time, hardly ever talk about it anymore.
So, two things to keep in mind here at the end of this section. Not only do we now see the Corps of Discovery, very important, but Aaron Burr, after he shoots Alexander Hamilton, he will escape to the West. When his term is over as vice president, the West at that time is here. Southern, starts out, he's in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, makes his way south. It's out here in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas area that he attempts to establish a Western nation with him as the leader. He's eventually indicted for treason and found innocent, but ruined by disgrace. He is ruined in politics. He's only the second vice president, one of two, to be indicted for treason. The other was a former vice president who was indicted for treason during the Civil War for their support of the Confederacy. Now, the next thing that we see that it's important, I should have a whole slide for this, and I may develop one, is the conflict with the Barbary pirates in Northwest Africa. The pirates were expected that each nation would pay them a fee so that they were unmolested in trading in the Mediterranean. These are the very first, if you want to call them, Islamic terrorists. The Barbary pirates from Tunisia would harass shipping. As long as American ships were thought of as part of the British Empire, they were not subject to paying of these fees. One of the earliest payments that the U.S. Congress came up with was to pay off these pirates. But Thomas Jefferson decided that he would not pay this anymore. So, he wanted to remain neutral with France, in the Franco-Angevin War in 1805, Essex was stopped from trading with France. Britain impressed sailors from American ships into the Royal Navy. If you happened to be an American, they would just kidnap you and force you to serve in the British Navy. The Chesapeake ship, 4 British sailors impressed and 3 Americans killed with 18 wounded. America's national pride was greatly hurt. In order to keep us out of war, Jefferson created what became known as an embargo that kept America out of war, but it had a disastrous effect on the economy. He would not trade with any country. Therefore, we were not going to get involved with this war one way or the other. Jefferson would not fight, but he almost ruined the economy. He does send in the Navy to destroy the Barbary pirates, though. The Marine fight song, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The shores of Tripoli are the first naval invasion, or the Marines that attacked the Barbary pirates in Tripoli, in Tunisia and Libya, those areas, and let the Barbary pirates know that they would not be able to force the Americans to bow to them. At the very end of John Adams' time, one of his most important ending legacies is what we might know as his midnight appointments to the Supreme Court and other courts. And he did stay up late that night before his last day of the presidency until midnight, signing judgeships that had been approved by the Senate. In 1801, John Marshall will become one of the longest serving Supreme Court Chief Justice. He will lead the court from 1801 until 1835, a long time. And he will be the most powerful Federalist in the government during that period, and he will die in office. Probably the most important decision that he makes as Supreme Court Chief Justice in enforcing it is Marlborough versus Madison. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court can invalidate a federal law by declaring it unconstitutional. This court decision by the Supreme Court, they just said they could do it. It gave them the right of judicial review of the constitutionality of laws was established. Now, I don't have a problem with that. What I do have a big problem with is the idea that a federal judge, just any old federal judge, can declare a law unconstitutional themselves. Supreme Court maybe, but not just a regular federal judge. And that is becoming a major problem, where a judge can declare a law, a federal law, unconstitutional, and then that must be appealed up to the Supreme Court in order to see whether or not that will stand. So, that's a review of the court, and during this period, Madison and Jefferson and Marshall, they're all from Virginia, and they really don't get along. They're not friends from the same state. They're on opposite political grounds, and he's a very influential and powerful figure. Now, I'm not going to get into the legacy of Jefferson. We'll talk about this when we come back on Wednesday, but here is the Jefferson Memorial. This was built in the 1930s by Roosevelt. It's designed to be where it is so that from the White House, you can look out the east side of the White House and you can see the Jefferson Memorial. It's in a direct line. So that the statue keeps an eye on the president of Jefferson, so that he keeps in line. Jefferson is watching. So that's that's what goes on there. There was some fear that building this might disturb some of the cherry trees that bloom every year, but Washington, it was built anyway. All right, well, we'll see you next time, Wednesday.